Sitaram Yechuri, General Secretary of the Communist Party of India, Marxist, and a long-standing friend of mine. I've known him from his time at the JNU as an SFI leader. Comrade M.A. Baby, my long-standing friend and an outstanding fighter for the revolutionary movement. Again, one who fits the description Comrade Sitaram gave of an organic intellectual. My Comrade Shashi Kumar, who is my comrade both politically and professionally. Minister, Education Minister, Comrade Shivankutti, M.G. Radhakrishnan, Parvati, Executive Secretary of the Kendram, Comrade Nagappan. It's an honor to receive the P. Govinda Pillai National Puraskaram for the year 2022. And it's a special pleasure Comrade Sitaram presented to me along with the citation. This award, I was very pleased to learn that the first award went to an outstanding fighter for justice, Prashant Bhushan, last year. A lawyer who has dedicated his life and all his intellectual energies to the cause of justice and to the cause of ordinary people. As has been mentioned in earlier speeches, Comrade PG was an outstanding communist leader and intellectual who dedicated a great deal of his energy and time to writing and pro-people journalism. I struggled to find an adequate characterization of PG's contribution, and after talking to my friend Dr. V.K. Ramachandran and others, I had a pretty good idea of his many-sided accomplishments, apart from what we just heard from Sitaram about being an organic intellectual in the true Marxist sense. PG had a thirst for knowledge. His areas of special interest were society, politics, history, literature, culture and art. V.K. Ramachandran described him to me as Kerala's bibliophile. And I quote, put him in a room with a collection of books that was new to him and he was mesmerized. His face would fall into reading mode and he would browse the collection book by book. He had an immense curiosity about books and new books and the ideas they sought to convey. This is already reflected in what Sitaram said about his interest in Gramsci. I read that when he introduced this work or spoke about it to Comrade E.M.S. Nambudripad, E.M.S. jokingly chided him for not bringing this to his attention a decade earlier. In fact, I have the book as a Kindle edition for those who are interested in this. It's also available as a Kindle book. PG was also a historian and scholar of Kerala's social transformation, particularly of its enlightenment and renaissance, that is from the late 19th through the 20th centuries. And a special point he made was that the Kerala Renaissance of this modern period differed from the Renaissance that occurred elsewhere, for example, in Bengal, in West Bengal and the whole of Bengal. In this respect, that one of the most oppressed communities at that time, there was mass mobilization and support from that community for the Kerala Renaissance. This distinguished it according to PG. I read about it in a scholarly paper which became a chapter in a book edited by Jean Bress and Amartya Sen. And I believe PG followed up on it. I don't know enough about it because it is in Malayalam. He also contributed to the historiography of the Kerala Renaissance. He was a student of folklore and folk culture in Kerala. He's a writer of many books. Comrade Baby told me the other day that they would always tell him they regretted the fact that he didn't convert all his interests and ideas into more books. A popular writer of Marxist interpretations of Indian society and history. But here we come to his contribution as a journalist and editor. I remember many years ago, Comrade EMS gave a new direction to party journalism in Kerala, and I think this model was accepted in other states where the left had a considerable presence. The call was to convert Deshabhimani from what was often dismissed as a party gazette into a comprehensive newspaper that covered everything, that covered all aspects of life these were relevant. It was not just a newspaper that would report or comment on what the CPIM or the left movement was doing or other progressive movements in India. It would cover everything, including sports, entertainment, culture, the arts, and so on. And it is clear that this new direction found the man. And under PG's editorship of Deshabhimani, I know this because I had some interactions on this on previous occasions. Under PG's editorship, which was for a decade and a half, I believe, and under the editorship of his successors, Deshabhimani has successfully transformed itself from what used to be called a party newspaper or a party gazette into a newspaper, of course committed to the cause of the working class and working people, of course espousing and giving special attention to the activities, the achievements, the weaknesses and so on of the CPIM and the left movement, but also competing with other general newspapers in that professional space. And I think this was a considerable achievement which the value of which cannot be possibly underestimated. Comrade Baby asked me to say a few words on the state of journalism today. We already heard Shashi Kumar's keynote address on this, and we are completely on the same page when it comes to evaluating the journalism of the present. It is clear that there is a need for discovering or rediscovering value in journalism. And let us remind ourselves that we are functioning in a very challenging time when the Hindutva authoritarian regime dominates Indian politics, and as Sitaram mentioned, it's not just a political domination, there's a coalescence of political authoritarianism which often unleashes communal violence, but it's more than just that. The coalescence of that and big business. Never has a political regime in India, even in Indira Gandhi's days, during the emergency, got such strong, solid support from the big business class in India. And that is a feature that has put enormous pressure on independent journalism in India. What is journalism? There are many definitions, but the best one, the most handy working definition, is that it is a democratic craft, or should aspire to be a democratic craft. And it includes, it's a form of expression or brain work, this is a definition you often read about, that includes making news judgments, gathering evidence, constantly constructing narratives and making sense of things. It's also a method of capturing the world, or an attempt to capture the world of events and ideas as they occur. Journalism cannot be value neutral. You have this myth of neutrality, sometimes cloaked as objectivity. Journalism always takes sides, whether you recognize it or not. And the idea of objectivity, it goes back to Walter Lippmann in the early 1920s, when Walter Lippmann, along with a co-author, authored a brilliant study of the failure of the New York Times when it came to covering the Bolshevik Revolution. Many times Lenin was declared as dead, and if you go back to that essay, it's a scathing and powerful attack on the kind of journalism that is pure propaganda. And so Walter Lippmann, analyzing the journalism of his day, the highly propagandistic journalism of his day, came to the conclusion that objectivity was not an attribute or a quality of journalism. Objectivity was a method, just like the scientific method, a method of approaching information based on discoverable evidence. It's a method, just as scientists try to discover the truth in a particular field and put it through a test. It's known as falsifiability. That truth or that information or that discovery has to be falsifiable through testing. In the same way, this is an ideal that he put forward. I don't think it was ever achieved in any satisfactory way, but the idea was a method of evaluating what came to hand, verifying, playing the devil's advocate with the evidence, and making sure that you are not taken for a ride. Some of the journalists here would immediately think of what happened to The Wire in recent times when it did this story on the head of the BJP's IT cell, Malviya, and earlier on the Take Fox story where the editors of The Wire and the journalists were clearly taken for a ride. They put out information that was not clear, or that was not true. Fabricated information was fed to them. So, what was the response? Immediately, an assault on a criminal case on the editors of The Wire and the journalists concerned, as well as the business and product head, leaving out the person who was instrumental in this fabrication. I don't want to take names here on this issue, but consider this. Journalism makes mistakes all the time. Can you think of a more calamitous mistake or blunder than what the New York Times did during the Iraq War? Let's go back to 2002, 2003, before that invasion, that barbaric attack led by the United States against Iraq and its people. And the central myth was manufactured by the US establishment that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And a well-known journalist called Judith Miller fabricated evidence that finally was used to sway public opinion on this in the United States and elsewhere. And that story has not been fully explored or investigated, but there's quite a literature on it. Is there any media organization anywhere in the world which has not been made huge blunders, which has published or broadcast fabricated information, which has been free from propaganda or feeding false information of the kind that Shashi Kumar referred to when you see the social media, the disinformation that abounds in the social media. And yet, The Wire, although it made an egregious mistake, an extraordinary mistake, blunder, it was a fiasco, you can say, but they did not do it deliberately. At least the people who are being accused in this completely unjust and over-the-top first information report, that is the criminal investigation by the Delhi Special Branch of the Delhi Police. This brings to mind the need to adopt the methodology that Walter Lippmann and many others have advocated for journalists as an ideal. And I think that's very, very important for journalism of the present. Today, journalism, many individual journalists as well as media organizations face serious challenges. There is pressure, there is risk, there is intimidation, there is a threat to their survival, and there are direct physical attacks. We know that according to the Global Media Freedom Index or Press Freedom Index put out by RSF, Reporters Without Borders, India ranks 150 out of 180 countries countries and territories figuring in this index. And the country file that is appended to that index notes that India is one of the most dangerous places for doing independent journalism in the world. Several journalists have been murdered in connection with their work. Since 2002, the Committee to Protect Journalists has meticulously documented the number of reporters and other journalists, including freelance journalists, who have been killed in every country in the world. And India is always up there along with the countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and some of the African countries and some Latin American countries as well. But more significantly, India also figures as a founding and permanent member of the Club of Shame called the Global Impunity Index. What is that index that CPJ puts out? That is a Committee to Protect Journalists. Journalists are killed not in any private dispute, not in some family matter, but in connection with their work, and justice has not been rendered in that case. Not in a single case has it reached the final solution that the accused are either acquitted or convicted. It's partly explained by the law's delays, but a lot of it is cover up of what has happened. And these are people who are vulnerable and highly defenseless. Let us not be carried away with these claims about India and democracy, and certainly not in the area of media freedom. And this, I think, many journalists have been imprisoned, spending a lot, months and even years, booked on sedition and anti-terrorism laws or various sections of the Indian Penal Code. It goes back to Thomas Macaulay. And for example, the most notable case perhaps is of Siddiq Kapur, who went to investigate an alleged rape and ended up incarcerated for no good reason, other than that he's a Muslim, and other than the fact that he was going to investigate proactively a case of alleged rape and murder as well. And yet, the courts are not giving him enough relief. Although the Supreme Court ordered bail in a particular case, they used another section of the law to keep him there, defying this. And very often, I think the Chief Justice recently made this point, that the subordinate judiciary is afraid of giving bail, is unwilling to give bail in cases where it is obvious that somebody is being framed or is being punished for his or her views. The other major threat is disinformation, scaled up on the social media. That's what got the Wire into some trouble, because they were investigating a very legitimate issue, the way the social media, through their algorithms and also deliberately, privilege certain messages at the expense of others. Meta, for example, or Twitter, which is now with Elon Musk. Disinformation must be distinguished from misinformation. Disinformation is deliberate it is motivated and scaled up on an industrial scale on social media platforms. And India is among the countries most affected by disinformation. We know that during in-season, during election season and out of season as well. Because India has the largest number of users of Facebook as well as Instagram among the countries of the world. This is a major threat. Women journalists also face the threat of rape, the threat of assault, the kind of shaming of women, attempted shaming of women that occurs on social media platforms, and often the law doesn't provide timely relief in this respect. This is, during this authoritarian regime, you can't disconnect what is happening in the media space, in the media ecosystem, from what is happening in the larger polity and also in the economy. This is a fact that often eludes journalistic understanding. You don't get it in editorials in newspapers, or certainly not on the propaganda channels that masquerade as news channels. I don't want to name names here, but you'll recognize those channels. Very loud, often spouting falsehood, propaganda, and so on. This is there. Sometimes I'm reminded of a very famous lines written in the 1920s by Humpert Wolff. This can describe or characterize the attitude of major sections of the mainstream Indian media. Not all, but quite significant sections. And the lines by Humpert Wolff refer to the attitude of the British journalist in the 1920s. And I quote, "You cannot hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist. But seeing what the man will do unbribed, there is no occasion to." This, I think, accurately describes what is happening in India today among significant sections of the so-called, the established media. Call them what you will: the mainstream media, the professional media, the established media, the legacy media, and so on. I think there is that. We are old enough, I think most of us are old enough here to remember the emergency, the complete censorship that was imposed, and the struggles that were not undertaken within the media organizations against this atrocious demonstration of authoritarianism. And people ask us, is this another emergency? And here I want to come to something positive. I say, no, this is not another emergency. That was short-lived, that's different. This may be longer-lived. But there are large spaces in the Indian media ecosystem where people can express independent and critical views. Some of them have to pay a price for it, but let us not fall into gloom or despair. Particularly young journalists should not do this. Just as Sitaram mentioned, that you can do things positively, you can challenge this, however bleak it may look in a particular point of time. I think the same thing applies to journalism, independent journalists, progressive journalists, journalists who believe in social justice, who want to advance the cause of the working people, the millions who are victims of deprivation, mass deprivation in India. And I think there are these spaces, and if I may advocate something that we do at the Asian College of Journalism. This is what Shashi Kumar, I to some extent, and our faculty at the Asian College of Journalism and in similar places where they exist, try to do among young journalists, teach them about the values of journalism, the principles involved, the method that people like Walter Lippmann advocated, and above all, we come back to the contribution of PG as an organic intellectual, to quote from Sitaram, and as an outstanding writer and journalist. Sometimes he pushed it to the limits, we know that. But sometimes he pushed it to the limits of what his political movement thought was appropriate, but he always stayed within that. he remained loyal to the revolutionary movement, to the party that he contributed so well to, and he is a special case, I think, of an organic intellectual who contributed in many fields, and were PG, who passed away about a decade ago, alive today, I think he would certainly have reason to be deeply concerned about this. But at the end of the day, I think that he would have been more positive, because this can be fought, this can be resisted, particularly if more young people came out with their views and refused to be silenced, the way Humpert Wolff described the British journalist attitude. So thank you for this honor. I'm happy to accept the citation and the award. As for the cash prize, I will consult with Comrade Baby to see which organization can be the recipient of this. I'll do that, because he's already told me about it. Thank you very much.